Hello, everyone. We are looking at conducting World War II through strategies in both military and political, as well as economic and social and cultural. Propaganda is going to be a major focus of this, as are the actual strategies that were used. We'll be talking about firebombing. You may have heard that before as casual bombing. And we'll be looking at how the rise of government ideology, including fascism and communism, allowed the mobilization of state resources. We are on topic 7.7. After roughly 1.5 million German soldiers, 2,000 airplanes, and 2,500 tanks crossed the Polish border on September 1st, 1939, the British gave Nazi dictator Adolf Hitler an ultimatum: pull out of Poland or else. And Hitler ignored this demand. 2 days later, on September 3rd, 1939, Britain and France declared war. Mind you, guys, Hitler had already invaded Austria, the German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia, as well as the Rhineland. Pardon me. Previously, the other European powers had pursued a strategy of appeasement, giving Hitler what they deemed reasonable concessions in order to avoid an all-out war. That strategy reached its apex when the three parties signed the Munich Agreement on September 30th, 1938, giving Hitler permission to keep the German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia, known as the Sudetenland, on the condition he would not invade any more territory. But 6 months later, in March of 1939, Hitler violated this agreement by absorbing all of Czechoslovakia. World War II, with the introduction of motorized weapons, gave back the advantage to the offensive, as may be seen in Germany's Blitzkrieg, which is lightning war, and the American and Japanese use of aircraft carriers. The Germans overran Denmark, Norway, Belgium, Holland, and northern France in 1940. In the battle for Britain, the Luftwaffe, which was the German Air Force, bombarded England with bombs in a preparation for an invasion. Britain rallied around Prime Minister Winston Churchill and his encouraging speeches. Southern France was controlled by a French government that collaborated with the Nazis. Charles de Gaulle formed a free French government in exile in London. In many countries, there were underground resistance movements. There was also war in North Africa and Southeast Europe. The size and mobility of the opposing forces in World War II meant that the fighting ranged over vast theaters of operation, that belligerents mobilized the populations and economies of entire continents for the war effort, and that civilians were consequently thought of as legitimate targets. It took less than a month for Germany to conquer Poland. After a lull during the winter of 1939 to 1940, Hitler went on an offensive in March that made him master all of Europe between Spain and Russia by the end of the war. By the end of June. Wow. By the end of June. Hitler's attempts to invade Britain was foiled by the British Royal Air Force's victory in the Battle of Britain from June to September of 1940. In June of 1941, Germany violated its pact with Soviet Union and actually invaded. In 1941, Hitler launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. His forces were successful at first, but Hitler apparently learned nothing throughout his history courses. German forces were stopped by the winter weather of 1941 to 1942. They gave up trying to take Moscow in 1942 and finally were defeated at the Battle of Stalingrad in February of 1943, failing in his last chance of winning the war. In Africa, the Italian offensive in British Somaliland and in Egypt, although initially successful, was turned back by a British counterattack. German forces came to assist the Italian army, but they were finally defeated at El Alamein in northern Egypt by the British, who had the advantage of more plentiful weapons and supplies, as well as better intelligence. In July of 1941, France allowed Japan to occupy Indochina, and the US and Britain responded by stopping shipments of steel, scrap iron, oil, and other products that Japan needed. In 1941, the US did not fight, but agreed to supply arms to the British. Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to the Atlantic Charter. Both affirmed national self-determination. The US guarantees moral and material support to the British. Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to the Atlantic Charter, but this is where things are going to draw the U.S. into the war. In 6 months of offensives prior to Midway, the Japanese had triumphed in lands through the Pacific, including Malaysia, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, and numerous island groups. The United States, however, was a growing threat, and the Japanese Navy sought to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet before it was large enough to outmatch their own. In response to the threats, the Japanese chose to go to war, and they hoped that a surprise attack on the U.S. would be so shocking that the Americans would accept Japanese control over Southeast Asia rather than continue fighting against the Japanese. Japanese propaganda declared a greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, which would free Asians from Western imperialism. And in the summer of 1941, tensions between the U.S. and Japan had increased. Japan planned and executed an attack against American forces at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and proceeded to occupy all of Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies within the next few months. The direct attack on a U.S. territory led the American people to join Roosevelt's call to go to war. The Allies took the offensive in the Pacific in 1942. They took control of the Burma Road from Japan. By June of 1942, after a 4-day sea and air battle, the United States had destroyed 4 of Japan's 6 largest aircraft carriers, which were key to victory in the Pacific. And since Japan did not have the industrial capacity to replace the carriers, they now faced a long and hopeless war. The U.S. only lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown. This epic fight would be referred to as the Battle of Midway. Japan's losses hobbled its naval might, bringing Japanese and American sea power to approximate parity, and it marked the turning point in the Pacific theater of World War II. There are 3 major battles that we need to look at here, and one was Pearl Harbor. Japan intended the attack as a preventative action to keep the U.S. Pacific Fleet from interfering with its planned military actions in Southeast Asia. However, this attack commenced at 7:48 Hawaiian time, and when the base was attacked, 2 separate waves were launched from 6 aircraft carriers from the Imperial Japanese aircraft. During this attack, all 8 U.S. Navy battleships were damaged, with 4 sunk. All but the USS Arizona were later raised, and 6 were returned to service and went on to fight in the war. The Japanese also sank or damaged 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, an anti-aircraft training ship, and 1 mine layer. 188 U.S. aircraft were destroyed, 2,403 Americans were killed, and 1,178 others were wounded. Important base installations such as the power station, dry dock, shipyard, maintenance, and fuel and torpedo storage facilities, as well as the submarine piers and headquarters building, were not attacked. Japanese losses included 29 aircraft and 5 submarines. 64 servicemen were killed, and 1 Japanese soldier was captured. The Battle of Coral Sea was fought between May 4th through the 8th, 1942. Although it was a tactical victory for the Japanese in terms of ships sunk, the battle would prove to be a strategic victory for the Allies for several reasons. The battle marked the first time since the start of the war that a major Japanese advance had been checked by the Allies. And finally, the Battle of Midway. This was a decisive naval battle in the Pacific theater of World War II that took place between June 4th to the 7th, again, 1942, 6 months after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor and 1 month after the Battle of Coral Sea. The U.S. Navy, under Admirals Chester Nimitz, Frank Fletcher, and Raymond Sprutenance, defeated an attacking fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and they inflicted devastating damage on the fleet that proved to be irreparable. Military historian John Keegan called it the most stunning and decisive blow in the history of naval warfare. Historian Craig Simmons called it one of the most consequential naval engagements in world history. It was both tactically decisive and strategically influential. World War II was different from previous wars, both in its enormous death toll and the vast numbers of refugees that were generated during the war. The unprecedented scale of human suffering during the war was due to a change in moral values and to the appearances of new technologies of warfare. Science had a significant impact on the technology of warfare, which can be seen in the application of scientific discoveries to produce synthetic rubber and radar, developments in cryptanalysis and antibiotics, the development of aircraft and missiles, and the US government's organization of physicists and engineers to produce atomic weapons. The British and Americans relied heavily on bombing raids that were intended not only to strike individual buildings, but to break the morale of the civilian population. Massive bombing raids on German cities caused substantial casualties and severely affected Germany's ability to transport oil and manufacture synthetic fuels. German armament production continued to increase, however, until late 1944, and the German people remained obedient and hardworking despite the bombings. Japanese cities, with their wooden buildings, were also the targets of American bombing raids. Fire bombs devastated Japanese cities. The firebombing of Tokyo in March of 1945 killed 80,000 people and left 1 million homeless. And what we see is the Blitz of London, the firebombing of Dresden, and the bombing of Tokyo. And this is obviously what has survived, what's left after the bombs. By 1943, the Soviet Red Army was receiving supplies from factories in Russia and the US. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met for the first time in person in Iran in 1943. The defeat of Germany began on June 6, 1944, when the Allies invaded Normandy. The Soviet offensive in the east, combined with Western invasions of Sicily and Italy in 1943 and of France in 1944, defeated Germany by May of 1945. It was also by this time that American bombing and submarine warfare had devastated the Japanese economy and cut Japan off from its sources of raw materials, while Asians who had initially welcomed the Japanese as liberators from white colonialism were now eager to see the Japanese leave. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945 convinced Japan to sign terms of surrender early the next month. Hundreds of thousands died in the atomic bombings. Japan continued to fight until September 2nd, 1945, also known as VJ Day. Some leaders wondered if the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was necessary. U.S. government officials argued that it ended the war a year earlier than it would have without it, and that it saved hundreds of thousands of American soldiers' lives. Winston Churchill, on the other hand, claimed that Japan was already all but defeated before the first atomic bomb fell. In addition to employing certain ideologies, governments also used various strategies like speeches and art to intensify nationalism. This is propaganda. So some of what we saw in class was propaganda to rally feelings of patriotism or, to shame people to have feelings of patriotism. But other propaganda was used to incite hatred against the enemy. And some of what we're seeing is here. So the first one, destroy this mad brute, enlist in the U.S. Army. And what we are looking at here is a way to incite hatred against German militarism. And obviously you can see we've got a mustached ape-like monster who's wearing an army helmet and carrying what is a bloodstained club. You can also see what is supposed to be Lady Liberty being carried away over his arm. The ground at his feet is discreetly labeled America. The second of what we are looking at is actually, it's the triumph of will. And this was made by filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl. And the overriding theme is the return of Germany as a great power, with Hitler as the leader who will bring glory to the nation. And because the film was made after the 1934 Night of Long Knives, which took place on June 30th, many prominent members of the SA are absent because they were murdered in the party purge that was organized by Hitler to replace the SA with the SS as his main paramilitary force. And finally, what we're also seeing is We Shall Fight on the Beaches. And it's a common title given to a speech delivered by Winston Churchill to the House of Commons, to the Parliament of the UK on June 14th, 1940. It's actually the second of three major speeches given around the Battle of France. The others were entitled Blood, Toil, Tears, and Sweat, a speech on May 13th, and This Was Their Finest Hour, speech on June 18th. Events developed dramatically over the 5-year period, and although broadly similar in themes, each speech addressed a different military and diplomatic context. In this speech, Churchill had to describe a great military disaster and warn of a possible invasion attempt by the Nazis without casting doubt on eventual victory. He also had to prepare his domestic audience for France's falling out of the war without in any way releasing France to do so, and wished to reiterate a policy and an aim unchanged. Despite the intervening events from his speech, he declared the goal of victory, however long and hard the road may be. All right, guys, that's where we're going to stop for today. Our next topic is the final one for this unit, and it's mass atrocities after 1900. So as always, if you have questions, send me an email. Otherwise, have a great night, y'all. Cheers.